The red light on Fifth Avenue had never seemed to last so long. It hung in the humid July air like a malevolent eye, holding Robert Anderson hostage in a river of yellow cabs and black town cars. He was a man accustomed to motion, to the relentless, forward momentum of a life built on shrewd decisions and calculated risks. At 45, he commanded a small empire of financial analytics from a glass tower that pierced the Manhattan skyline. His world was one of numbers, of predictable patterns and profitable outcomes. Stasis was anathema. He drummed his fingers on the polished wood grain of his Mercedes steering wheel, a rhythmic, impatient beat that did little to soothe the coiled knot of anxiety in his gut. For 4 days, the rhythm of his life had been shattered. The numbers had become meaningless, the patterns chaotic. For 4 days, his daughter, Sophie, had been gone. The city moved around him in a familiar, chaotic ballet. Steam billowed from a manhole cover, a siren wailed in the distance, and pedestrians flowed across the crosswalks in a torrent of summer attire. It was all just noise, a meaningless backdrop to the silent, screaming void that had opened up in his life. He watched it all through a haze of sleeplessness and dread, his mind replaying the same loop of unanswered questions and terrifying possibilities. Then, through the shimmering heat rising from the asphalt, something snagged his attention, pulling the world into sharp, sudden focus. It was a boy weaving between the idling cars with the practiced agility of a creature born to this concrete jungle. He couldn't have been more than 12, with a thin frame that seemed too fragile for the city's hard edges and large watchful eyes that took in everything. He was selling candy from a cardboard box, his voice a reedy chirp that was mostly lost in the urban symphony. But it wasn't the boy who made Robert's blood freeze and his breath catch in his throat. It was what hung around the boy's neck, against the dark skin of his thin chest. A silver butterfly glittered. It was an intricate, delicate thing, its wings encrusted with tiny, winking diamonds that caught the afternoon sun. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, painful drumbeat. He knew every facet of that pendant, every curve of its silver wings. He had commissioned it himself from a quiet, brilliant jeweler in the Diamond District, a man who understood that the value was not in the carats but in the sentiment. It had been Sophie's Christmas present, a one-of-a-kind piece for his one-of-a-kind daughter, the same Sophie who had vanished from her bedroom 4 days ago without a trace, leaving behind only an open window and a silence that was louder than any scream. Thought evaporated, replaced by pure, primal instinct. The car was still in drive, the light still red, but none of it mattered. Robert wrenched the door open, the heavy metal groaning in protest. The sudden movement sent a jolt through the adjacent lane, earning him an immediate, furious blast from a taxi horn. "Kid, wait." His voice was a raw, desperate croak that was swallowed and spat out by the city, but the boy heard it. His head snapped up, his eyes locking with Robert's for a split second. In them, Robert saw not curiosity, but immediate, ingrained fear. The boy whose name was Marcus, though Robert didn't know that yet, didn't hesitate. He jumped, spun on his heel, and ran. It wasn't paranoia. It was a lifetime of street-honed experience. A rich white man in a Mercedes, his face a mask of wild-eyed intensity, yelling at him from the middle of Fifth Avenue, was a prelude to nothing good. It meant trouble, it meant accusations, it meant a world of hurt he had learned to navigate by being faster and smarter than the threat. Forgetting the car, the keys still in the ignition, Robert launched himself into the street. The symphony of horns became a cacophony of outrage. Tires screeched. A driver leaned out of his window, his face puced with fury, screaming obscenities that bounced off Robert's consciousness without leaving a mark. "Please," Robert yelled, his expensive leather shoes pounding against the pavement as he dodged. "A bicycle messenger, I just want to talk about the necklace." He was a man who ran on a treadmill in a climate-controlled gym, not through the obstacle course of midtown traffic. His lungs burned, a stitch tightening in his side, but the adrenaline was afire in his veins. He saw the boy dart between two parked vans and onto the crowded sidewalk, a small, fleeting shadow in the throng of people. Robert followed, his 6-foot frame a clumsy battering ram against the unyielding flow of pedestrians. He bumped into a woman, sending her shopping bags spilling across the concrete. "Sorry," he gasped, not breaking stride. He caught up to Marcus in the middle of the next block. The boy had stopped, leaning against a grimy brick wall, his chest heaving. He clutched the cardboard box of candy to his chest like a shield. His brown eyes, wide and wary, sized Robert up with the precocious wisdom of someone who had learned to read intentions as a matter of survival. He was calculating angles, escape routes, the likelihood of violence. "I didn't steal anything, sir," Marcus panted, his voice a mixture of defiance and fear. He held up his free hand as if to ward off a blow. "I swear to God, I didn't." Robert leaned over, hands on his knees, fighting to draw a clean breath. He had to calm down, to quell the frantic terror in his own voice. He looked at the boy, truly looked at him, and saw not a thief, but a child trying to stand his ground in a world that had given him no ground to stand on. "I know," Robert managed, his voice trembling despite his efforts to control it. "I know you didn't steal it." He straightened up slowly, holding his hands out, palms open. A universal sign of peace. He hoped the boy would understand. "That necklace, it belonged to my daughter. She's missing." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Missing, a sterile, inadequate word for the gaping wound in his life. Marcus hesitated. The frantic energy in the man's eyes was still there, but it was being eclipsed by something else. Something Marcus recognized even if he hadn't seen it often. It wasn't the anger of the cheated or the accusation of the police. It was the hollow, ragged edge of pure desperation. It was the sound of a world that had crumbled. The boy's gaze flickered from Robert's face down to the butterfly pendant, then back up, the hard-won shield in his eyes lowered, just a fraction. "I found a girl," he whispered, the words barely audible above the city's roar. He took a half-step closer, his voice dropping even lower, forcing Robert to lean in. "She was hurt, hiding in an abandoned building over in the Bronx. I thought she was dead, at first." Robert's world tilted on its axis. The sounds of the city faded to a dull, distant hum. The crowd of people became a blurry watercolor painting. The only thing that was real was this small boy and the impossible hope he was offering. "She gave me this," Marcus continued, his fingers tracing the outline of the butterfly. "She was too weak to talk much," said find her father. "She said he'd know what it was." Where the word was a choked, desperate plea. "Where is she? Is she alive?" "She's alive," Marcus confirmed, and a wave of relief, so profound, washed over Robert that his knees buckled. He gripped a nearby lamppost to keep from collapsing. "I took care of her for 3 days. Got her water, some food." He bit his lip, his gaze darting around the street as if checking for unseen listeners. "But she's told me things about who did this to her. And sir," he looked directly into Robert's eyes, "I don't think this was a normal kidnapping." A sliver of ice slid down Robert's spine, colder and sharper than the dread he'd been living with. For 4 days he had begged the police, who spoke of runaways and custody disputes. He had hired the best private investigators money could buy, men who brought him nothing but grainy surveillance footage and dead ends. He had offered a reward that had yielded only a flood of cruel hoaxes and false hope. And all along, the key, the answer, the one person who had found his daughter, was a street kid. A boy so invisible to the world that society had forgotten he existed. "Take me to her," Robert said, his voice raw with urgency. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out his car keys, the Mercedes emblem glinting in the sun. "Now, okay," Marcus said quietly, "but there's something you need to know first." He looked around again, a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. It was a fear not for himself, but for what he was about to say. "Before I found her, Sophie, I saw who left her there. And if I'm right about who it was," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You're not going to like this." Robert stopped, the keys growing heavy in his hand. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked him straight in the eye, the precocious wisdom replaced by a solemn gravity that was unnerving in a child. "It was someone she knew, someone you trusted, and from the way he was talking on the phone while I was hiding and listening, this was all planned to destroy you, too." The 40-minute subway ride to the Bronx was a descent into a surreal, waking nightmare. The screech of the train's wheels against the tracks was the soundtrack to Robert's world unraveling. They couldn't take his car, Marcus had insisted. It was too flashy, too noticeable. There would be ghosts. So they'd slipped into the sweltering underground, two figures from opposite ends of the city's spectrum, united by a single, fragile thread of hope. Pressed shoulder to shoulder with the evening commuters, Robert listened as Marcus recounted the details of the past 3 days. The boy spoke in a low, steady voice, his narrative punctuated by the automated announcements of station stops. He'd been scavenging for scrap metal in a derelict tenement building, a place the city had condemned but not yet demolished, when he'd heard a faint sound, a whimper from the basement. He described finding Sophie in a dark, flooded corner, her small body curled up on a pile of sodden newspapers. She was dehydrated, her lips cracked, and there were angry red marks on her wrists, raw and chafed, as if she'd been tied up and had fought against her restraints. She'd flinched when he'd first approached, her eyes wide with a terror that had taken him a full day to soothe. He'd brought her bottles of water and bags of chips he'd bought with his candy money, and a worn one-eyed teddy bear he'd won at a street carnival years ago. Each detail was a fresh stab of pain for Robert, while he had been sitting in sterile police precincts and liaising with expensive investigators. This child, this stranger, had been keeping his daughter alive, but the most disturbing part of Marcus's story was the name, a name Sophie had whispered in a feverish, broken state, over and over, always followed by a fresh wave of tears. Uncle David. The name struck Robert with the force of a physical blow. David Mitchell, his best friend for 20 years, his business partner, Sophie's godfather, the man who had held him up at his wife's funeral the previous year, a rock of support in a sea of grief, the same David who had been at his house every day since Sophie's disappearance, his face a perfect portrait of concern and shared anguish, the same David who had, just weeks ago, insisted that Robert upgrade his family's security, citing a vague bad feeling and news reports of rising crime. "It's a fortress now, Rob," he'd said, clapping him on the shoulder after the new system was installed. "No one's getting in or out without us knowing." The memory was now sickening, twisted into something monstrous. Had he been casing the place, finding the blind spots? Here Marcus whispered, pulling Robert from his toxic reverie. They had emerged from the subway into the fading light of a Bronx evening. The air was thick with the smell of grilled meat from a street cart and the distant pulse of a reggaeton beat. Marcus led him down a street of red brick buildings, their facades a canvas of vibrant, overlapping graffiti. He stopped in front of a structure whose windows were boarded up with weathered plywood, a red X painted on the door signifying it was unsafe for entry. "She's in the basement," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "I got her some water and snacks this morning, but she's barely eating. And sir," he hesitated, touching Robert's arm, "when we get there, don't yell or anything. She's really, really scared." Robert nodded, his throat too tight to form words. He followed Marcus around the back, through a fence where the chain links had been peeled back, and toward a set of concrete steps leading down into darkness. The air grew cool and damp, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Marcus clicked on a small flashlight, its beam cutting a weak path through the gloom. His heart was beating so hard he was sure it echoed through the damp, narrow hallway. Every horror movie trope, every nightmare he'd ever had, coalesced in this single, terrifying moment. And then, the flashlight beam found her. She was huddled in a corner on a dirty, stained mattress that looked like it had been salvaged from a dumpster. She was clutching a small one-eyed teddy bear he had never seen before. Her blonde hair was matted and dull, her clothes were filthy, but it was her. It was his Sophie daddy. Her voice was a hoarse, broken whisper, a sound that shattered what was left of his heart. She lifted her face, and Robert saw the dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. He saw a look in those eyes, a haunted, knowing look that no child should ever have. It was the look of someone who had seen the monster behind a familiar face and understood that the world was not safe. He didn't run. He glided, crossing the distance in 2 long strides and collapsing to his knees beside her. He wrapped his arms around her small, trembling frame, holding her gently, as if she were made of spun glass and might break at the slightest pressure. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of dust and fear, and, underneath it all, the faint, familiar scent of his daughter. "I'm here, sweetheart," he murmured, the words thick with unshed tears. "I'm here, you're safe now, you're safe." She clung to him, her small hands gripping the back of his shirt with surprising strength. But as he held her, his mind was a maelstrom of rage and confusion. David Howe, why? The man he'd trusted with his life, with his daughter's life. The pieces began to click into place with sickening clarity. David's insistence on not involving the police right away. "Let's give it a few more hours, Rob," he had said, his voice calm and reasonable. "Maybe she just wandered off. The police could complicate things, scare her into hiding. A few more hours for what?" Sophie's voice, a faint whisper in his ear, answered the question. "Uncle David, he said it was a game," she breathed, her body trembling. "A surprise for you. He said you knew about it. But then he got angry. He was on the phone, yelling at someone about money and contracts." She shuddered, a full-bodied tremor. He said that if I told anyone, something bad would happen to you, too." Marcus, who had been standing back, giving them their moment, now stepped forward. He had been watching the reunion with his arms crossed, his young face etched with a grim maturity. "Sir, there's more," he said quietly. "She told me about your company, this Uncle David, He was talking on the phone about transferring money, about signing some papers while you were distracted, looking for Sophie. Robert felt the blood drain from his face. The distraction, it wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a smokescreen. Over the past 4 days, while he had been living in a private hell, frantically searching for his daughter, he had handed the keys to his kingdom to the man who had stolen her. David had temporarily taken over his responsibilities at the company. He had access to the accounts, the contracts, the client lists. Robert had given him full authority, signing the temporary power of attorney without a second thought. Blinded by grief and gratitude for his friend's unwavering support, he dropped his cell phone once. When he was leaving, Marcus continued, his voice flat and factual. It was on speaker. I was hiding in the hall. I heard him talking to someone. He said, when he finds out what happened to the company, his daughter's pain will seem like nothing. And then he laughed. Sir. Marcus's eyes met Robert's, and the boy's expression was one of cold fury. He laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. Robert closed his eyes, hugging Sophie tighter, trying to absorb the sheer black-hearted evil of it. 20 years of friendship, of shared holidays, of business triumphs, of leaning on each other through life's darkest moments. David had been by his side when his wife, Sarah, had lost her battle with cancer. He had held a newborn Sophie in his arms at the hospital, promising to always protect her. He had been the first to offer help, the first to show up at his door, the first to feign tears over her disappearance, and it had all been a lie. A meticulously crafted, monstrous lie designed to facilitate corporate theft. He crouched down beside them, his small frame radiating an intensity that belied his years. Sir, I know this is hard to hear, but there's something else you need to know about this man. He looked Robert straight in the eye. He's not doing this alone. Yesterday morning, when I brought Sophie some food, I saw him talking to 2 other men in suits. They pulled up in a black car, right at the end of the block. I recognized one of them, from the TV. He's that politician, the one who's always talking about family values and keeping the city safe. Robert's world, already spinning, threatened to fly apart completely. This wasn't just a personal betrayal by a greedy friend. It was a conspiracy, a calculated plot involving powerful people, and he had been the perfect mark. A grieving widower, a single father, a man completely focused on his business, who trusted his inner circle without question. But as he held his trembling daughter and looked at the solemn, determined face of the boy whom society had made invisible, the boy who had been the only one to truly see and to help, something inside Robert began to shift. The searing pain, the disorienting grief, it wasn't disappearing. It was changing, cooling, hardening. It was crystallizing into something cold, sharp, and far more dangerous. It was determination. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw not a victim of the streets, but a survivor, a warrior in his own right. Marcus, he said, his voice quiet but imbued with a new, steely resolve. Do you want to help me bring these men down? The boy nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. There was no hesitation. Then we're going to have to be a lot smarter than they think we are. Robert continued, a plan already beginning to form in the wreckage of his mind. Because what David Mitchell and his powerful accomplices didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have accounted for in their arrogant calculations, was that Robert Anderson hadn't clawed his way to the top of the New York business world by being naive. He had done it by being ruthless, by out his opponents, by understanding that in every game there is a predator and a prey. For 4 days, he had been the prey. Now, with the truth revealed and an unlikely, invisible ally at his side, the hunt was about to begin, and the revenge that was taking shape in the damp, dark basement would be more calculated, more devastating, and more complete than anything they could have ever imagined. Asterisk for the next 24 hours, Robert Anderson performed the most difficult acting job of his life, while Sophie, under the pseudonym Jane Doe, was being treated for dehydration and trauma in a private hospital room guarded by a security detail loyal only to him. Robert orchestrated a public collapse. He did something David Mitchell would never have expected from the relentlessly driven man he thought he knew. He appeared to give up. The media alerts were cancelled. The private investigators, men David himself had recommended, were dismissed with a hefty severance and a story of emotional exhaustion. Robert's voicemail message was changed to a somber, broken-voiced plea for privacy, to the world, and more importantly, to his enemies. Robert Anderson was a man shattered by grief, retreating from the world to lick his wounds in private. David called 3 times that first day. His voice was a masterpiece of theatrical concern, thick with feigned sympathy. "Robert, my friend, you can't give up now," he'd urged. "We're so close. I can feel it. Sophie needs you to be strong. Let me handle things at the office. You just focus on getting through this." It was almost impressive, Robert thought with a cold, detached fury, how sincere he could sound, knowing exactly where Sophie was, knowing the trauma he was inflicting. He was playing the part of the loyal friend to perfection. But Robert was no longer in the audience. He was backstage, rewriting the end of the play. His second move was something no millionaire businessman in his right mind would ever do. Checked out of his sterile, silent penthouse on Park Avenue and, using a cash deposit, temporarily moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, 3 blocks from the derelict building where Marcus had found Sophie. The apartment was above a bustling bodega, and the sounds of the neighborhood, the music, the arguments, the laughter were a constant, vibrant reminder of the world David and his friends believed they floated above. If this was to be a war, Robert needed to be on the ground, not in a tower. He needed real intelligence, not the filtered reports of expensive detectives David could buy off with pocket change. Marcus proved to be a more valuable ally than a whole firm of investigators. The boy was a ghost, a whisper in the city's alleys. He knew every shortcut, every rooftop access point, every broken surveillance camera. He knew the faces of the neighborhood, the rhythms of the street, the currency of information and silence. More importantly, he was utterly invisible to men, like David Mitchell and Congressman Harrison. To them, he was part of the urban landscape, as unremarkable as a fire hydrant or a discarded newspaper. Mr. Robert, Marcus said on the second morning, returning from a reconnaissance mission that had consisted of him loitering near the abandoned building with his candy box. His intelligence was raw, unfiltered, and priceless. "That politician I saw, Congressman Harrison, I found out where he stays when he comes to the Bronx to meet with Uncle David." A sly, knowing smile touched the boy's lips. "It's a cheap motel by the highway, the kind of place he wouldn't want his wife or his campaign donors to know about, but the real stroke of strategic genius, the move that would transform their quest for vengeance into a righteous crusade for justice, came when Robert, acting on a tip from the bodega owner, walked into a small storefront legal aid clinic. There he met Elena Rodriguez. Elena was 38, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a demeanor that radiated a fierce, no-nonsense competence. She had grown up in this same neighborhood, had fought her way through law school, on scholarships and grit, and had dedicated her career to fighting for the people the system was designed to crush. She harbored a special, incandescent hatred for powerful men who abused their privilege. She listened to Robert's story in her cluttered, cramped office, her face impassive. She reviewed the timeline, the names, the financial documents Robert had managed to download from his company's servers before David could lock him out completely. "Let me get this straight," she said finally, leaning back in her creaky office chair. She tapped a pen against a stack of files. "Your best friend of 20 years, your daughter's godfather, kidnaps her as a diversionary tactic to give himself time to systematically loot your company. And now, he's pretending to be your shoulder to cry on while he finalizes the theft." She let out a short, bitter laugh, typical of the sheer, unadulterated arrogance. "And I bet," she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, "he has a plan to find Sophie himself, to come out of this looking like the hero who saved the day." She was right. Through a discreet inquiry made by one of Robert's few remaining loyal contacts, he discovered that David had devised a dramatic final act. Within 48 hours, he planned to stage a heroic rescue, claiming a lucky break in the investigation. He would be the hero who brought his best friend's daughter home, earning eternal gratitude and a controlling interest in a no-gutted company. No one would ever suspect he had orchestrated the entire nightmare. While Elena began to map out a legal strategy, Marcus became the perfect spy. He was a shadow with ears. David and his accomplices, blinded by their own arrogance, spoke freely around him, discussing details of their scheme as if the boy were a piece of furniture. He learned names, meeting places, and even bank account passwords mentioned in careless, boastful conversations. "They're meeting tomorrow," Marcus reported that evening, his voice low and excited as they sat in the small apartment. A map of the city spread out on the rickety kitchen table. 2 o'clock, an expensive Italian restaurant on the east side. The politician, Harrison, is getting $50,000 for his cooperation. And there's a third man, a cop, Detective Murphy. He's the one making sure the official kidnapping investigation goes nowhere. Robert felt a cold, calculating anger take hold of him. It was a clean, pure rage that sharpened his thoughts. David hadn't just betrayed a friendship, He had corrupted a politician, sworn to serve the public, and a police officer, sworn to protect it. He had turned the abduction of an innocent child into a sordid business transaction. But it was Alina who delivered the best news of all. The news that would be the linchpin of their entire plan. She called late that night, her voice crackling with triumph. "Robert, your brilliant, arrogant best friend made a fatal mistake," she said. She explained that she'd used her contacts to get a subpoena for certain bank records. "He moved the money from your corporate accounts using a series of wire transfers. They leave a permanent, undeniable trail. But here's the kicker. To speed up the process and avoid certain flags, he used his own personal offshore account as a temporary bridge for one of the largest transfers." "What does that mean?" Robert asked, his heart beginning to pound. "It means we have him, Robert, cold. We have irrefutable, documentary proof that he personally handled the stolen funds. These aren't just suspicions or a little girl's testimony that his lawyers could tear apart. It's evidence. Hard, beautiful, damning evidence that no high-priced lawyer in this city can contest." That night, while Sophie slept peacefully, in a safe, comfortable hospital room, Robert looked out the window of the modest Bronx apartment. Down on the street, under the orange glow of a streetlight, Marcus was teaching some of the younger neighborhood kids how to play chess on a makeshift board drawn on the sidewalk with chalk, using bottle caps as pieces. It was a scene of simple, profound community, a world away from the gilded cage he had once inhabited. It made him think about what, and who, truly mattered in life. "Marcus," he said, when the boy came upstairs later, "tomorrow we're going to put our plan into action. But first, I need you to know something. After this is all over, you're not going back to the streets, ever." Marcus looked at him, his eyes, which had seen far too much of the world's ugliness, suddenly vulnerable. "Are you sure? I'm not like you guys. I don't know how to be rich." "You don't need to be rich, Marcus," Robert said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You just need to be a kid. You need to be safe. You need to be free. And after what we do tomorrow, David and all of his powerful friends are going to learn that underestimating people like us was the biggest mistake of their lives. Because while David thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime, he hadn't accounted for three crucial, game-changing variables: the unbending resolve of a desperate father, the razor-sharp intelligence of an invisible boy who heard everything, and the righteous fury of a community that was about to discover just how the other half played with human lives for the sake of greed. The meeting at the Italian restaurant was set for Tuesday, but David Mitchell and his accomplices didn't know that their celebration of victory was about to become their public execution. They didn't know that every word would be recorded, every transaction documented, and every lie exposed on a stage far larger than they could ever have imagined, turning their private betrayal into a devastating, career-ending humiliation. Robert had learned something fundamental during his days in the Bronx. Sometimes the most effective strategy is not to attack from the top down, with power and money, but from the bottom up, with truth and justice. Especially when you have allies. Your enemies can't even see. Tuesday arrived with a heavy gray sky that seemed to anticipate the storm about to break over David Mitchell's world. At 2 p.m. sharp, he strode into La Scogliera, the upscale East Side restaurant, wearing a $3,000 suit and the easy, confident smile of a man who believes he has orchestrated the perfect crime. He didn't notice the delivery boy in the corner, a kid with a cardboard box who was strategically positioned with a clear view of the secluded corner booth. He didn't notice the discreet high-fidelity microphone sewn into the boy's jacket, which was already transmitting every ambient sound with crystal clarity to Alina, who was monitoring the feed from a nondescript van parked 2 blocks away. "Gentlemen," David said, his voice smooth as silk, as he greeted Congressman Harrison and a beefy, florid man he introduced as Detective Murphy. He signaled the waiter, "A bottle of your best champagne. I believe we have a victory to celebrate." What David didn't know was that Robert had spent the last 48 hours not just gathering evidence, but meticulously building a network of exposure. 3 hidden micro-cameras, installed by a private security expert who owed Robert a significant favor, captured different angles of the table. 2 of the city's most tenacious investigative journalists, hungry for a story that would blow the lid off the city's corridors of power, waited in the bar, posing as patrons. And most importantly, the live audio and video feed was already being streamed to a newly created social media account, an account that Robert's marketing team had spent a small fortune promoting over the past day, teasing a major expose of corruption. It already had over 200,000 followers waiting. 50,000 for you, Harrison, David said, sliding a thick envelope across the polished table. for your legislative support on our upcoming zoning variants." He slid another thinner envelope toward the detective. "And 34 you, Murphy, for ensuring the Anderson kidnapping investigation remained a masterclass in incompetence." He chuckled, a low, arrogant sound. "Robert is probably at home, staring at the walls. He still thinks we're looking for his daughter. Pathetic." It was then that Marcus calmly stood up and walked over to their table. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, his voice polite and steady, a stark contrast to his simple, worn clothes. "My name is Marcus, and I believe I have something that belongs to you." David frowned, his bonhomie evaporating into irritation. "Kid, I don't have time for whatever you're selling. Get lost." "I'm the one who found Sophie," Marcus said, his voice suddenly gaining a firm, clear authority that made the three men freeze, their champagne glasses halfway to their lips. "I'm the one who listened to you laugh about her pain. And I'm the one who is broadcasting this entire conversation live to the world. Right now." David's face, moments before flushed with triumph, drained of all color. What are you talking about?" Marcus smiled. It was no longer the smile of a vulnerable street kid, but the confident, knowing smile of someone who had learned to play chess with masters and was about to declare checkmate. "Look around you, gentlemen. See that woman at the bar reading the newspaper? She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter. The two men who just walked in and are heading this way, they're FBI agents. And that little red light on the flower arrangement on your table, that's camera number 3. Harrison tried to stand, but his legs were shaking so badly he sank back into the booth. That's impossible. We were careful." "You were arrogant," said a familiar voice from behind them. Robert Anderson appeared, walking calmly toward the table. He was flanked by Alina, who held a thick legal folder, and the two federal agents Marcus had pointed out. "You underestimated a desperate father," Robert said, his voice devoid of heat, as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "You underestimated a brilliant lawyer. And most of all, you underestimated a boy you couldn't even see." David shot to his feet, his composure finally shattering, replaced by raw animal panic. "Robert, you don't understand. I can explain. We've been friends for 20 years. Friends don't kidnap their friends' daughters." "David," Robert replied, his voice an icy calm, "friends don't steal their companies. And friends certainly don't laugh about causing psychological trauma to a 9-year-old child for profit." Alina stepped forward and opened the folder. "David Mitchell, you are being charged with kidnapping, extortion, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and the corruption of public officials." She then fixed her gaze on the other two men. "Congressman Harrison, Detective Murphy, you are also under arrest. I suggest you remain silent." But the real devastation, the true, modern-day public execution, was yet to come. Marcus pulled out a tablet and turned the screen toward the three men. "Want to see something interesting?" he asked. "Our little live stream just passed 500,000 viewers. The comments are, well, you can imagine." The screen showed a torrent of indignant messages flooding the feed. The hashtag justice for Sophie was the #1 trending topic worldwide. David Mitchell's name was being digitally tarred and feathered, associated with terms like child abductor and psychopathic traitor in thousands of posts per second. A live stock market ticker showed that his publicly traded company, the one he had tried to steal, had lost 40% of its market value in the last 15 minutes. A news alert popped up on the screen. David Mitchell's wife had just released a public statement through her lawyer, announcing she was filing for an immediate divorce on grounds of moral turpitude. Harrison was hyperventilating, clutching his chest. "My career, my family, I have children." "Sophie has a family, too," Robert said coldly. "Or she did. Did you think about that when you sold her safety for $30,000, Murphy?" The detective, his face the color of ash, began to babble. "I can cooperate. I can give you information on other cases. I can help." "A little late to play the hero, Detective," Elena said dryly. "You had a 20-year career to do the right thing. You chose to do it when you thought no one was watching." As the agents snapped handcuffs on their wrists, David made one last, desperate appeal, his eyes wild with disbelief. "Robert, please. We grew up together. You were the best man at my wedding. It can't end like this." Robert stared at him, a long, silent moment passing between them. "You're right, David," he said softly. "It can't end like this." He paused, letting the words hang in the air before delivering the final, devastating blow. "It has to end with complete and total justice." Alina held up another document she'd been saving. "David, do you remember that wire transfer you funneled through your personal offshore account? Well, it turns out that wasn't just evidence of theft. It was evidence of something the federal government takes even more seriously. She allowed herself a small, grim smile. It was evidence of felony tax evasion. The IRS would like to have a long talk with you about the last 10 years of your tax returns. It seems you owe the American people roughly $2 million in back taxes, plus penalties. They tend to be very aggressive about collecting. In that moment, David Mitchell finally understood the full, terrifying scope of his destruction. It wasn't just prison, it was total financial ruin, public disgrace, a divorce that would strip him of half of what was left, children who would surely change their last names in shame. It was a legacy of pure, unmitigated infamy. As he was led away by the agents, a broken, hollowed-out shell of the man who had walked in an hour earlier, David looked back one last time. Through the restaurant window, he could see a small crowd gathering on the sidewalk, their cell phones held high, recording the arrest. Robert wasn't looking at him. He had his arm around Marcus, and both of them were watching the scene unfold, not with triumph, but with a quiet, somber resolution. How? David muttered to himself, the question a ghost of a whisper. How did a street kid and a broken man manage to destroy me so completely? The answer was simple, but it was a lesson David Mitchell would never comprehend. They hadn't underestimated anyone. He had underestimated everyone. And in the brutal, unforgiving game of power and betrayal, the one who underestimates is the one who always loses everything. 6 months later, Robert Anderson sat in the corner office of the Phoenix Initiative, the new consulting firm he had founded after liquidating his stake in his previous company. Through the panoramic window, he looked out at the Manhattan skyline, but he saw it with new eyes. It was no longer a landscape of conquest, but a community of possibilities. His firm's mission was not just profit, it was purpose. A knock on the door brought his attention back to the room. Marcus, now 13, entered holding a thick folder. He wore the crisp blazer and tie of the prestigious St. Andrew's Preparatory School, but the same sharp, determined light shone in his eyes. He was taller, his frame filling out, but he still moved with the quiet, observant grace he'd learned on the streets. "Mr. Robert," he said, his voice now a confident tenor, "the quarterly reports for the foundation are in. We've helped another 250 kids get off the streets and into safe housing and school programs." The Marcus and Sophie Foundation, created with the millions recovered from David's scheme and the subsequent civil lawsuit, had become a national model for child protection and advocacy. Sophie, now 10 and thriving in therapy, had insisted Marcus's name come first. "He saved me first," she had stated, with a simple, irrefutable logic that had left no room for argument. Alina entered shortly after, her briefcase in hand. She was now a full partner in the firm and the pro bono legal director of the foundation. "I have news about our old friends," she said, her smile professional but tinged with the satisfaction of justice served. David was sentenced to 25 years in a federal penitentiary, no possibility of parole. Harrison lost his re-election by the largest margin in the state's history and is facing a mountain of ethics investigations. And Murphy, she let out a small, bitter laugh, is serving 5 to 7 and will likely lose his pension. But the consequences had rippled far beyond the courtroom. The live video of the arrest had been viewed over 50 million times. The hashtag never underestimate had sparked a social movement, encouraging ordinary people to report corruption. 3 production companies were in a bidding war for the documentary rights. More importantly, the case had emboldened others, and dozens of smaller-scale corruption cases had come to light as people realized they had the power to confront injustice. Robert looked at the framed photo on his desk. It was of him, Sophie, and Marcus on the steps of the courthouse the day the adoption was finalized. Marcus had chosen to keep his last name but was now legally Sophie's brother and Robert's son. "I want to honor where I came from," he had explained with a wisdom beyond his years. "But I also want to belong somewhere." That evening, as Robert drove them home from Sophie's equestrian therapy session, she asked a question none of them expected. "Dad," she said, her voice quiet and thoughtful, "have you forgiven Uncle David?" Robert was silent for a moment, navigating the evening traffic. "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, sweetheart," he said finally. "And it doesn't mean what he did was okay. It means you refuse to let his anger and his ugliness control your life anymore. He made his choice. We're making ours." Marcus, sitting in the passenger seat, nodded. "On the streets, you learn that revenge and justice are 2 different things," he added. "Revenge is about hurting the person who hurt you. Justice is about making sure they can never hurt anyone else again." Sophie smiled. A genuine, bright smile that lit up her whole face. And it's about building something better, right? That was exactly right. The Phoenix Initiative now exclusively employed people the system had underestimated: rehabilitated ex-offenders, skilled immigrants who'd been overlooked, single mothers re-entering the workforce, people with disabilities. Their productivity was 28% above the industry average, and their employee turnover was nearly zero. That night, after dinner, Robert received a call from the governor's office. They wanted to discuss a statewide partnership, using the foundation's model to reform the foster care system. When he hung up, he found his 2 children looking at him with undisguised pride. "You know what's funny?" Sophie said, toying with the silver butterfly necklace, which she now wore every day. "Uncle David thought he knew you, but he only knew the you that you showed the world. He had no idea who you really were underneath." Marcus laughed. "It's like chess. You let your opponent think he's taking all your important pieces. By the time he realizes you've been setting him up for checkmate the whole time, the game is already over." Meanwhile, in a federal penitentiary 400 miles away, David Mitchell sat in a small, concrete cell, rereading a tattered newspaper article about the success of the family he had tried so viciously to destroy. His wife had remarried, his children had changed their names, his assets had been auctioned off to pay damages. But what tormented him most was not what he had lost. It was the knowledge that Robert, Marcus, and Sophie had built something greater, more meaningful, and more powerful than he ever could have. He had acted out of envy and greed, and had only managed to destroy himself. They had responded with love and resolve, and had created a legacy. Robert closed his laptop that night, a sense of deep, quiet satisfaction settling over him. The table next to him was covered with Sophie's latest drawings, their new family, a smiling portrait that now included Alina, who had become much more than just a business partner. They were living proof that family isn't about blood, it's about who you choose to fight for. Marcus walked into the room to say goodnight, a ritual they'd had for the past 6 months. "Mr. Robert, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you think any of this would have happened if Uncle David hadn't been so greedy?" Robert thought for a long moment, looking from the boy's earnest face to the picture on his desk. "Maybe not, Marcus, maybe not. Sometimes, the worst people do us the greatest favor of our lives. They show us who we really are when we're tested, and that was the ultimate truth." David had tried to break a family but had ended up forging an unbreakable one. He had tried to steal a child's future but had ended up giving him a home and a purpose. He had tried to destroy a man but had only succeeded in revealing the hero, who lay dormant underneath the bespoke suits and the corporate armor. The real victory wasn't seeing David Mitchell in prison. It was seeing Sophie laugh without fear, watching Marcus graduate with honors, and knowing that hundreds of other families were being made whole through the foundation that was born from pain and had blossomed into hope. Because in the end, the best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building something so beautiful and so meaningful that their evil becomes an insignificant footnote in your story. It's proving, for all the world to see, that love, courage, and justice will always win, so long as good people refuse to accept the darkness as their fate.